Those of you who have heard or seen me speak before know that I often like to talk to the kids. Well, we don't have any kids here today, but I'm going to do it just the same. I don't want to change my modus operandi just for that. So, you may remember this is Fred the Platypus, and one of my oldest friends. And this is Maxine, who I think of as an emu. Actually, I think she was an ostrich when she was built, but I'm into Australian animals. So here we go. So Fred and Maxine are discussing me. What's Harry up to now? Words, words, words. Same old, same old. Where are the kids? Where's our audience? Apparently Harry's world's in some kind of lockdown. We're stuck with adults today. So we're going to California. Yeah, some of our buddies did not make the cut. Yeah, well, it's a tough game. I heard Bubbles is on the bubble. You'd think a manatee would get a guaranteed ride from a guy born in Tampa. Da-da-da. I'm going, I got in. Now Pooh Bear is on the bubble. Congratulations, buddy. Maybe we can do a little show like this out there. God knows what will happen in California, and she and I are not in touch. What's Harry talking about today? Myths and the unconscious. What's that all about? He says it's partly about us. Us? How can it be about us? Harry says we are part of his personal myth. He says we are not real in the material world, but we're real in the world of his psyche. Far out. Yeah, apparently his conversations are considered unreal by most people, but they are real in Harry's subconscious. I'll buy that. Harry wants the stage back. Go for it, Harry. Go get it, baby. Do a good job. Bye-bye.
Okay, so Harry Baya is our speaker today, and I will let him take it.
My talk today is very much based on a book. This is Carl Jung's Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And I first read this in the 70s and was very impressed by it then. And I recently reread it, and then I read it a third time for this talk. I didn't quite make it all the way through, but I got through almost everything. So that's what this is about. It's about really, well, I'll tell you. So here's the talk. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist who was born in 1875 and died in 1961 at the age of 87. Almost everything I know about Carl Jung comes from reading and studying Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, a kind of autobiography he began writing when he was 83. If I could communicate to you the power that I think is suggested in Jung's musings in this book, I would disrupt your life. Don't worry, that's way beyond me, but beware, I will do the best I can. This talk will attempt to communicate two things: my reaction to and thoughts about some of Jung's insights, and my understanding of what Jung wrote about his experience of discovering and exploring what he called the unconscious. The terms psyche, consciousness, and unconscious come up a lot in this talk. I use the term psyche to refer to the human mind. An individual human can be seen as having two parts, a physical body and a psyche. The physical body is composed of matter. It's part of the material world and can be studied by using the tools of science. The psyche refers to the mental part of the individual. It does not have a material existence. It's a process, a structure, a dynamic changing interaction. The psyche weighs nothing. The term psyche is somewhat interchangeable with mind, self, mental identity, and perhaps sometimes soul. In this talk, I will divide the psyche into two parts, consciousness and the unconscious. Perhaps it would be more correct to refer to the second as the unconscious part of the psyche, or unconsciousness. However, I choose to use the term unconscious. The unconscious is the part of an individual's psyche of which he or she is not conscious. I want to repeat that. The unconscious includes everything in the individual's psyche of which he or she is not conscious. Jung saw the unconscious as having two parts: the personal part that was somewhat unique to the individual, and the collective part that was common to all humans in all cultures. Some of the personal part of the unconscious was derived from the life experience of that individual. This starts from the moment of conception. It is difficult for an individual to access the unconscious part of their psyche. Jung viewed dreams as the most important avenue of access to the unconscious. Jung's view was that dreams were entirely the creation of the unconscious. I believe the following excerpt from the book will tell you more about Jung's understanding of the unconscious than anything I could say. In writing this, it's funny, I was hesitant to read much from the book because I thought I had things to say. And then I realized I'm not trying to say anything much. I have a few things to say, but really I'm trying to communicate Jung's perspective and insight. And I think this reading was probably the one that struck me strongest. So this is his words from the book. At that time, which was around 1909, he was born in 1875, so he would have been about 34. At that time, I was having dreams with collective content, containing a great deal of symbolic material. One in particular was important to me, for it led me for the first time to the concept of the collective unconscious, and thus formed a kind of prelude to my book, Psychology of the Unconscious. This was the dream. I was in a house I did not know, which had 2 stories. I was in my house. I found myself in the upper story, where there was a kind of salon furnished with fine old pieces in Rococo style. On the walls hung a number of precious old paintings. I wondered that this should be my house and thought, not bad. But then it occurred to me that I did not know what the lower floor looked like. Descending the stairs, I reached the ground floor. There, everything was much older, and I realized that this part of the house must date from about the 15th or 16th century. The furnishings were medieval, and the floors were of red brick. Everywhere it was rather dark. I went from one room to another, thinking, now I really must explore the whole house. I came upon a heavy door and opened it. Beyond it, I discovered a stone stairway that led down into the cellar. Descending again, I found myself in a beautifully vaulted room which looked exceedingly ancient. Examining the walls, I discovered layers of brick among the ordinary stone blocks and chips of brick in the mortar. As soon as I saw this, I knew that the walls dated from Roman times. My interest by now was intense. I looked more closely at the floor. It was of stone slabs, and in one of these I discovered a ring. When I pulled it, the stone slab lifted, and again I saw a stairway of narrow stone steps leading down into the depths. These too I descended, and entered a low cave cut into rock. Thick dust lay on the floor, and in the dust were scattered bones and broken pottery, like remains of a primitive culture. I discovered 2 human skulls, obviously very old and half disintegrated. Then I awoke. I realized that it was up to me to find out the real meaning of the dream. It was plain to me that the house represented a kind of image of the psyche, that is to say, of my then state of consciousness with hitherto unconscious additions. Consciousness was represented by the salon. It had an inhabited atmosphere in spite of its antiquated style. The ground floor stood for the first level of the unconscious. The deeper I went, the more alien and darker the scene became. In the cave, I discovered remains of a primitive culture, that is, the world of the primitive man within myself, a world which can scarcely be reached or eliminated by consciousness. The primitive psyche of man borders on the life of the animal soul, just as the caves of prehistoric times were usually inhabited by animals before man laid claim to them. The dream pointed out that there were further reaches to the state of consciousness I have just described. The long, uninhabited ground floor in medieval style, then the Roman cellar, and finally the prehistoric cave. These signified past times and past stages of consciousness. Certain questions had been much on my mind during the days preceding this dream. They were, on what premises is Freudian psychology founded? To what category of human thought does it belong? What is the relationship of its almost exclusive personalism to general historical assumptions? My dream was giving me the answer. It obviously pointed to the foundations of cultural history, a history of successive layers of consciousness. My dream thus constituted a kind of structural diagram of the human psyche. It postulated something of an altogether impersonal nature underlying the psyche. It clicked, as the English have it, and the dream became for me a guiding image, which in the days to come was to be corroborated to an extent I could not at first suspect. It was my first inkling of a collective a priori beneath the personal psyche. This I first took to be the traces of earlier modes of functioning. Later, with increasing experience and on the basis of more reliable knowledge, I recognized them as forms of instinct, that is, of archetypes. So that's the reading from the book. There were many vignettes in the book, and I think I could have given an interesting talk just reading vignettes of therapy experiences and insights and dreams, and analyzing his own dreams. Jung's life was focused on exploring the conscious and unconscious parts of the human psyche. His main interest in how this knowledge could be used to benefit individuals and the human race. He had other significant goals and great success in many fields. Jung considered himself to be, in many ways, a discoverer of much of the unconscious. More importantly, he saw his own psyche, his own mind, as a laboratory in which he could explore the unconscious. He was a bold and courageous explorer. Jung saw the unconscious as a layered construct that reflected the evolution of the human psyche. This evolution, starting with the earliest forms in our ancestral history, and evolved to bring consciousness into existence. Much of the evolution of the psyche was somewhat independent of biological evolution. I found that interesting, that the psyche is not material, and part of its evolution occurs in the non-material world. Animals have an unconscious mind, but very limited consciousness. So Jung's view is that as we go deeper and deeper into our unconscious, we reach the animal levels of our evolution, or could. In Jung's view, the most recent layers are the personal parts of each individual's unconscious. The deeper layers are common to all humans, and he called them the collective unconscious. In his attempt to explore and understand the collective unconscious, Jung found it useful to become a world-class scholar in many areas, especially history, religion, philosophy, and mythology. Consciousness is everything we are aware of in our thoughts. Everything that's not in our consciousness is the unconscious. Some of the contents of the unconscious are immediately accessible, easy to recall. We remember something. Until we remember it, it's in our unconscious. Some of those things are just very, very close to consciousness. In contrast, some things in the conscious are unconscious. Some things in the unconscious are very difficult to access. Jung suggests that the consciousness of individuals living in more primitive cultures contain a lot of what we now call myths. Those people spend less energy thinking about what to do next. Their myths guide them. Jung's view was that much of what matters in an individual's life relates to the relationship between their consciousness and their unconscious. Most humans have little or no conscious awareness of their unconscious. However, their unconscious is constantly affecting their consciousness. We can only explore our unconscious safely by remaining a conscious, sane observer. My understanding is that Jung found that even he could rarely maintain the observer perspective when exposed to the unconscious. On the edge of ancient maps, it used to say, "Here there be monsters." I think Jung's view of the unconscious was, as you went deeper, here there be monsters. He said that he felt at times he risked his sanity going as deep as he went into his unconscious. Jung felt that each individual had to create his own myth to enable him to have a stable, sane, satisfying life. Each individual would build their own myth during their life, but they could draw on the myths they found in their culture, those used by prior generations. The great religions served this need. Religions contain very powerful, very highly evolved, very well-structured myths that have evolved and served humans well over thousands of years. As humans rejected those myths as not compatible with modern consciousness, science, secular views, laboratory testing, they lost a vital element of their cultures. We need to replace our myths with ones compatible with our new understanding of the world. Jung's view is that religions are the cultural embodiment of the collective unconscious. I found that a rather strong, interesting statement, that religion, its primary function is to bring into reality as a myth the collective unconscious. And then I had a whole long section on the other parts of religion which were dysfunctional, but I decided that wasn't really relevant. The important part was there is in religion something of the primary need that humans have for a meaningful myth. One kind of insanity relates to becoming identified with the unconscious rather than normal consciousness. Jung felt normal consciousness should remain in the driver's seat. It should be in control. We need to access and learn from our unconscious, but not to turn it loose. So how do we access the unconscious? Jung suggests that there are two main gateways to this. The first is dreams. The second is myths. Jung felt that dreams are completely the creations of the unconscious. What we recall of dreams is what remains after these processes are filtered into the kind of material our conscious mind can deal with. I had a whole long section on what I thought was going on in the unconscious. And one part of it was that I don't think the unconscious uses words. I think it uses symbols and memes and things that it relates to in kind of an ecology. So when you bring it up into consciousness, it has to be filtered into something like words or symbols that we understand, which is not its natural content. The second access to the unconscious is myths. Myths are the individual and cultural embodiment of aspects of the collective unconscious. Let me read that again. Myths are the individual and cultural embodiment of aspects of the collective unconscious. Myths may or may not be real or true when viewed from the perspective of the material world. They may be impossible or improbable when looked at the way science looks at our material reality. Nonetheless, myths are very real as active processes, agents, and structures within the unconscious. The unconscious can communicate with the conscious via myths. Myths are real in the same sense that the psyche is real. Neither one has any weight. Neither one exists in a measurable kind of reality, but both are real in some sense. Jung felt that humans needed appropriate myths in their psyches in order to live meaningful, satisfying lives. Historically, and in primitive societies, these myths were often embodied in what could be called religion. A culture, or a tribe, shared a common religion that embodied a highly evolved myth that dealt with all the major questions faced by individuals. Why am I here? How do I decide what's good and bad? How do I decide who to marry? Why do bad things happen? And on and on and on. I, and many of you, are grounded in science and the material reality of our world. Either an assumption can be confirmed by science or it gets thrown in the same bucket as magic. Mysticism and much of religious faith, gets thrown in the same bucket as magic, mysticism, and much of religious faith. So anything that's not real, anything that's not material, anything that science can't study, we tend to think of as magic. A nice catch-all phrase for this stuff is woo-woo. Well, guess what? Jung had a lot of woo-woo perspective and opinions about the unconscious, particularly the collective unconscious. Before he went off to university, Jung had several very powerful spiritual experiences, kind of direct contact with some aspect of God or the universe or the unknown, or whatever you want to call the great mystery of existence. These were not particularly related to any religion or faith. They were more like direct awareness of awe, fear, and grace. So far as I know, he did not discuss these or write about them until this book. So during his entire professional career, remember he was 83 when he started writing this book, and he wrote over 20 major volumes of works and gave lectures around the world and published thousands of papers. He never talked about these very intense religious experiences he had in his youth that greatly shaped his perspective. But in this book, he opened up about them. Jung's father was a minister. His father told him thinking about religion, told him to stop thinking about religion and to take on faith what religion told him. His father said he should study and believe. Jung said, no. In matters such as this, one should experience and know. He pitied his father for being locked in this attempt to believe things for which he had no experience. Woo-woo time. We're getting, let's see how I'm doing on time. 20 minutes, I'm doing fairly well for me. This is where the end of the book, the last two parts of the book were the last three parts. One was on life after death. I'm not getting into that at all, Jung's perspective. But the next two were sort of end thoughts. And he got pretty far out there, and I found it fascinating. Jung suggested that the unconscious, especially the collective unconscious, did not come from our material world. His view was that we know as little about the unconscious as we do about spiritual experience, about God, about the devil. Jung said he chose to use the term the unconscious because it was not loaded with associations that would cloud what he wanted to say. He then said, from his perspective, he could have just as easily referred to the unconscious as God or the Holy Spirit or as the creator and source of all that is. So Jung's perspective was that the unconscious was not just a evolved thing in the human psyche. It was direct contact with the universe, the powers, those things that religions choose to call God. On page 340, here's a quote. This is something Jung said. For it is not that God is a myth, but myth is the revelation of divine life in man. It is not we who invent myth. Rather, to us, it speaks as a word of God. So Jung's pursuit of the unconscious, as particularly the collective unconscious, was a spiritual quest. He felt he was dealing with the great search of finding what it's all about, so to speak, the woo-woo side of existence. Here's a final idea for you to deal with. Jung's view was that each of us, this is just another little piece he threw in at one point, each of us, especially in the unconscious part of our psyche, carries the seeds of both good and evil. We have innately a dark side. So does God. In the Christian myth, he tries to prove his point that God has an evil side. In the Christian myth, God created the snake in Eden. God created the angels who fell to become devils and his minions. God tortured Job. God caused his own son to experience great suffering. In Jung's view, God and the devil are one. Spiritual experience, the numinous, the collective unconscious. He used the word numinous to refer to anything that had strong spiritual vibrations. And God and the devil are one. They are the same power. Good and evil are two sides of one object. He goes on to comment that monotheism implies a God that embodies good and evil. To have both a God and a devil as separate beings is a kind of dualism. He thinks it's a mistake. They should be combined into one being. Though we do not need to succumb to the demands of the dark side of our unconscious, we need to acknowledge it, to accept it, to allow ourselves to be aware of it and the dangers it presents. A culture that teaches impossible standards of behavior and that all who fail to meet them are failures is flawed. And Jung attacks our schools, our religions, our culture as setting up impossible ideals. He says politicians will preach to you of how you should behave as a good citizen, how you should behave as a good person, knowing that they cannot possibly live up to those ideals. And the same with preachers. He said, this is hypocrisy and it's wrong. We should have a culture that accepts that we are all flawed and does not fault us for it. We can strive to be better, but accept that with the dark side is good. Cultures that deal with the dark side of the psyche poorly fail us. The same is so of myths that do this poorly. There was a lot more discussion along this line of thought, but we end here. Thank you.